boy, oh boy, oh boy. Monday. Meant to do this last night, but we're going to go live today, Monday, on Labor Day. Unfortunately, it was only 6,000 degrees here yesterday, so we were not able to get the studio to, or my office, to a suitable temperature to actually sit in here and do some recording. So we're going to do this Monday, September 7th, Labor Day weekend, 2020, the year that just keeps on giving. So, episode 6, chugging along, trying to keep to a weekly schedule here. So far, so good. This week, we're going to have some fun. This week, we're going to talk about Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, two awesome comic creators who are no longer with us, but their influence is felt through all the superhero movies and most of the comic stories we see today. I also want to provide an update on the payphone adventure that I bought a payphone from eBay for my wife's birthday, and we'll get into that. Like I said, we'll talk about Jack Kirby. I want to give a little bit of an update on the weather out here. As I indicated in the beginning, it's just we're in the middle of a heat wave, smoke wave, hate wave as well. Everybody's angry and upset out in the world. Then we'll switch gears, lighten it up. I've been rereading Amazing Spider-Man starting from the beginning, back in Amazing Fantasy issue 15, and then Amazing Spider-Man issues 1 through 6. And I wanted to talk about those today. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about driving me crazy, And then last but not least, a little bit of an update on our upcoming Flex Seal extravaganza. Lots of fun coming up there. So first off, my wife worked for Pac Bell, AT&T, basically the phone company for years and years until my daughter started preschool, and then from that time on, she's been a stay-at-home mom, and just recently she's gone back to work. But back in the day, she worked at the phone company, as well as her father, her sister, aunts, uncles, a whole basically a little cluster of her family have been lifetime Pac Bell AT&T. So they have a lot of affection for the company, and especially the old-timey, if you, as my daughter says, old-timey, nostalgic paraphernalia and so forth. So I decided to try something different this year for her birthday, and what I wanted to do was get her a payphone, an old payphone, and not just here's the shell, but actually a working payphone that we could make phone calls from and that would collect coins. So I was able to find on eBay a working payphone, and there's a picture of it here. So I was got that to the house, and with a little bit of cleaning and a little bit of finesse, was able to actually plug it in and get a dial tone. Now, I'm not a phone guy. I've worked on computers, but never phones. And for most of the day on Friday and part of the day on Saturday, even a little bit on Thursday, I spent some time getting acquainted with the inner workings of a payphone and how to work on them and repair them. And I was surprised by a lot of what I've learned, and I was also confused by some of it. But let's start off with some of the basics. So one of the most interesting things I've discovered about working on the payphones was that once you open them up, they're fairly straightforward, simple machines. And that kind of makes sense if you think about it, because back in the day, the phone company wasn't going to spend weeks or months training people to work on these items. So they were designed and constructed in such a way that if there was a broken piece or a problem, whatever that piece or part was usually attached to an assembly of some sort. So inside of the phone, there's a coin acceptance assembly. There's the processing unit, the PCU boards that plug in, and everything is very modular. So I assume that back in the day, if there was a problem with one of the machines, they would just pull out the entire assembly, replace the assembly, close the phone up, and move on. And then the broken or damaged assembly would be taken back and either repaired or discarded to be used in another phone. The other thing I learned about was how phones have changed the same as computers have. So the payphone that's pictured here is actually from the 90s, from the 90s. So it actually has programming that needs to be done in order to make it work. The old rotary phones, or what they call the 3-coin phones that have the 3 coin slots across the top, those phones are all mechanical on the inside, and even the phone pieces are mechanical. But this one has a motherboard in it, and since it was last programmed in the 90s, the call rates, where the phone thinks it is, all of this type of information, the things that you need to take it to the next step. So as I said, I could plug it in and get a dial tone, but after that I couldn't actually place any calls. You try to dial out, and I would get prompted by the phone saying, hey, this is an invalid number. And then if I called the phone, which I could do, and picked it up, it would ask me for $12. So that actually led to some pretty funny jokes, because then my wife accused me of buying her getting her a payphone from a jail. And I had to inform her that actually I've learned about that, and typically the payphones in the jails have the red handsets on them. And don't have the coins. They're actually collect call phones only. But still, it was kind of funny. Now, we don't have a landline in our home, so one of the things in order to get the payphone to work, went back to the old internet days, and it was funny because I remember in the 90s I had one of the original Magic Jacks, and that allowed you to plug this USB device into the back of your computer, and you could make phone calls, local long distance calls, and you paid a very minimal fee for the entire year. Now, obviously, that technology has changed and been upgraded, and now I have the new and improved Magic Jack, and the service has increased a little bit because now they do have to provide 911, and they've added some other features because they are actually trying to compete with some of the voice over internet solutions. But for $50, a brand new piece of hardware, dropped it into the router. My home network picked it up and recognized it, registered online, and pretty soon, shortly thereafter, we were able to plug the payphone in to ensure that we had a dial tone and that the actual phone itself was working. So I had gotten it to a place where now I was stumped. So, okay, I knew we had to do this programming, but as I went out on the internet and discovered, again, programming back in the 90s for payphones was done one of two ways. Either the tech would call back to the home office, and the home office would dial into the payphone and deliver, it sounds like a fax machine, beep, 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 like the old AOL connections. And the programming would actually be delivered over the phone line to the phone itself, and you could update the programming that way. Now, obviously, the phone company doesn't do that anymore, and they're not going to do that upgrade of the software, especially for me, because I have an older payphone that I'm not actually using. It's not in service as a payphone. So I started to do what most people do, search the internet. And I think it was a couple of episodes ago I had talked about how the internet doesn't love you, and be careful about what you share on the internet. And especially in today's environment, without getting political, the internet can be a very angry and just kind of a sad place to go. But I'm happy to report that with a little bit of digging, I was able to find, believe it or not, payphone and phone booth internet groups. There's a Facebook group, payphones and phone booths. There's forums out there. The rotary phone forums were a boon of information. And what I discovered is that there's actually, this is a hobby. There's people out there that collect and restore old phones. And although I don't have any here locally, there's even a couple of small businesses scattered across the U.S. that actually have these old parts, either new or refurbished, and have people that are retired from the phone company that can help. And I joined a couple of the forums. I posted some pictures of the inside of the phone and asked some questions about the best way to go about taking that next step. And I had also indicated that this was a present for my wife and her history with the phone company. And here's one of those situations where the internet actually gave back. The internet loved me back. Within a couple of hours, I was in contact with a number of really nice guys that gave me the make and model on my phone, the type of board that was in it, the type of programming that would be needed, and offers of either helping me do it myself, all the way up to, if you just want to pack that thing up and send it to me, I'll be more than happy to finish the conversion and turn it into a working payphone for your wife, which I thought was amazing. And when I inquired, I said, for me at this point, I think that even though I'd have to eat the cost for shipping, that might be the best way to go, because Mike, the phone guy, collects payphones and restores them as a hobby. He has hundreds of them, I believe maybe even 1,000 or so. And he has the pictures of them on his website, and he's a retired phone company guy, and he loves to work on the phone. And even though I had offered to pay him for his time to do the conversion, he said, no, I don't want to do that. And especially since your wife used to work for the phone company, I would really like to help you with the project. And, all you have to, do is cover the shipping. And if I do need to replace any of the parts, I'll if you could reimburse me for the parts. And then if there's any parts in the phone that you're not going to be using after the conversion, if I could have those to use to help other people. And I was like, absolutely, that sounds like the best of all worlds. Now I just need to hold on for a couple of days. I had to order another handset and another cable. Although the photograph shows that one being in pretty nice shape, the handset is actually pretty well gone. It looks nice there because my neighbor and I had taped up the cord and the rubber grommet there, and spray painted it with a high gloss black spray paint, which cosmetically makes it look brand new, but the texture and feel on the phone are definitely not right. And for $22, I could get a brand new one. So once that cable arrives, we'll be packing up 47 pounds of American steel and aluminum, and sending it off for its final conversion into a working payphone. So it'll be 50 cents to make outgoing calls from our home, and we'll be able to receive calls. We'll be able to pick up the calls right from there. The other thing this has turned into is somewhat of a neighborhood project, in that one of my neighbors is interested in helping me to construct a stand or a post to mount this phone on. I don't actually want to mount this to any of the walls in our house. It's very, very heavy. And I don't know, even if I put it into a stud in this particular early 60s kind of slab home that we have here in California, I'm just afraid of what it's going to look like when we take it out. So what we're going to do is build a small post, and maybe even put a lamp on the top of it, and with a nice heavy base, and then we'll be able to move the phone if we need to, and still be able to use it in the house. So we're super excited about that. One of the other things that came in the mail this week is my new rugby jersey from the Lions, and they're a Super Rugby team from South Africa. I love the Spider-Man jerseys. They also, in this league, have other Marvel jerseys, such as the Hulk and Iron Man. And it's actually kind of funny to watch some of the clips online, because it looks like a whole team of Spider-Man out on the field. Collecting rugby jerseys is one of the things I started to do when I found myself traveling between Australia, New Zealand, and Ireland during both 2011 and 2015 Rugby World Cups. So during that time, I actually picked up and started to learn what I was seeing and watch the games, and especially given the fact that all three of those countries have a very rich and active rugby tradition, both at the national level and with local and regional teams and leagues in all the countries. So the new Spider-Man rugby jersey arrived. I'm super excited. My wife rolled her eyes because now I have, I want to say, probably 10 or 11 of these different rugby jerseys from all over the world. I don't get a chance to wear them a whole lot, but when I do, it's fun. So again, with all the things I could be doing on the internet, looking for obscure superhero rugby jerseys or even just cool rugby jerseys is a pretty safe activity. So there you go. There's your payphone update. We'll get back to you when it comes back, and maybe even share the phone number if anybody wants to try to call in once we get it up and working. So some more fun stuff that came through this week is from it's called a Kirby collector box, and Jack Kirby, for those of you that don't know, was the gentleman who, along with Stan Lee, created, for the most part, that early Marvel, pretty much everything in the early Marvel universe. There was some other people we'll talk about, Steve Ditko and his influence on Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, and some of the other Marvel books. But for the most part, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, with Stan Lee writing or putting together most of the stories, and Jack Kirby with his incredible art style for years and years, basically built the Marvel universe. In the 70s, he and Stan had a falling out, and for the first time, Jack Kirby left Marvel Comics and went over to DC Comics. But before he did that, he and another gentleman, Steve Gerber, who was also former Marvel and had left under, not of his own volition, they teamed up and actually did a comic series called Destroyer Duck, and there's a picture of one of the issues there, issue 3. But what really intrigued me about these Kirby collector boxes, is that although Jack Kirby's no longer with us, and there's no way I can even afford any of his original artwork, all of that stuff is very prized and expensive, and typically at auction. But apparently Jack's grandson has permission, rights, authority to package and market some of the stuff that Jack left behind, which included different pieces of production art, which were prints, early prints, proofs, if you will, of some of the comic art to check it out before it got sent for final printing, as well as different things from Jack's collection of comic stuff, if you will. So I had ordered a Kirby box, and I was drawn to it for one particular reason. Now, the prints, as you can see, are pretty amazing, and the Kirby cars, the Kirby machinery, the Kirby space landscapes have been talked about, written about. His imagination for a guy who was not a hippie or out in the counterculture, he was putting together some pretty far out stuff in the 60s. And the Kirby, I had seen the Kirby boxes when they had originally been offered online, but they were a little pricey at the time. And recently, Jack's grandson started dropping some of the prices on them, and I was drawn to a particular box or collection. They have a number of them, and as I was reading the fine print, what it says here is, hey, I'm Jeremy Kirby, Jack Kirby's grandson. Hey, I'm excited, blah, blah, blah. You're going to get these large prints. They're perfect. And lastly, each box will contain a comic book that was part of Jack's personal collection. So while I'll never be able to own a piece of Jack Kirby's original artwork, I was like, here's a weird thing. Like, so I actually have an opportunity to own one of Jack Kirby's personal comic books, something from his collection. And I didn't even care what the comic book was. It could have been an Archie, an old romance comic, Marvel, DC. I didn't care. But to my surprise, when the Kirby box came, there was a couple of things I wanted to do. So this is from watching Pawn Stars and Antique Roadshow or any of those things. And again, these are prints. These aren't original artworks, so they won't increase a huge amount in value, but they are somewhat limited, and I have a feeling these types of sets aren't going to be around for very long. There's kind of a window here from when Jack passed away, where you can still get some of this stuff at a reasonable price. So for about $50, I was able to get sets of these awesome prints, and for me it was really about getting the comic book from Jack's personal collection. And lo and behold, the comic that I got was that one of the issues of Destroyer Duck. And it's great because, first of all, this comic series was basically a giant FU letter to Stan Lee and Marvel Comics at the time, from both Steve Gerber and Jack Kirby. This was the comic he worked on between leaving Marvel, from the time when he left Marvel, but before he went to DC. So this also speaks a little bit to the Jack Kirby history that you don't get from just watching, the little Jack Kirby biographies and so forth on YouTube. So for me, this is probably one of my most prized comic books now, because I own one little piece of Jack Kirby history that very few other people will be able, except for the people that bought these Kirby boxes, will be able to get. Descriptions. Oh, the other thing I learned, so this was the thing I wanted to mention, was, so like I said, these aren't going to become hugely collectible, but there is kind of a window here. And I don't have a letter of authenticity or anything like that, so what I figured I needed to do was just to make sure that I could provide the history of when I bought the box, what was listed and what was the description of the item at the time it went on sale, a copy of the receipt to show what it was contained in the shipment that I received, and basically kind of give it that provenance, if you will. I think that's what they call it, which is the documentation. So if later on down the line I ever did want to sell it, while not ironclad, this does, I am able to put together the box that has the mailing label that matches the receipt and the contents that matches the description of the order, and the description of the item from the catalog. So like I said, later on down the line, this type of information will be very hard to find 5 or 10 years from now, because I don't know that I'd be able to dig it out of my emails. So what I did was I took all of this stuff and I printed it and then placed it into the box with the items. So that's a little bit about Jack Kirby, my Jack Kirby experience this week. Before we jump over to talk about Steve Ditko, who was another super influential comic creator from the 60s, probably best known for Spider-Man, again with Stan Lee. Let's take a little pause here and talk about the heat wave, the smoke haze, and now back to school days. It has just been one of the most miserable summers here in California since I moved here almost 20 years ago. Between the fires, the pandemic, 50 to 60% of the businesses or places that I would like that made California home for me are no longer available. My daughter can't go to the school with her friends, and I think we might just be getting to that place where the downside to what's available into California is beginning to outweigh the upside. To the point where now my 11-year-old daughter is starting to. I'll get up in the morning and I'll look at my inbox and there'll be a couple of Zillow listings. So even my daughter's out looking for houses, which I think is pretty funny. But hopefully we're going to break the heat wave sometime this week, and hopefully get the fires under control so we could get our air back. And then obviously as we move into fall, winter, and spring, the pandemic, as well as some treatments and vaccines, hopefully become available so we can have a little bit more of a normal life here in what used to be sunny California. Spider-Man. So Spider-Man's my guy, and I've read all of those early issues of Spider-Man so many times as a kid, and even as a teenager, that I kind of stepped away from them for a long time. I haven't read these stories in 25 years now. And again, over the pandemic, I've been pulling together some trade paperbacks, which are actually these softcover collections of all of the old original Spider-Man books, and have started to go back, and starting from Amazing Fantasy, I'm going to read everything all the way up to issue 150 again. And as I've been going back and looking through these old issues of Spider-Man, I've been noticing a lot of things. A lot of things that I didn't pick up on the first time, and a lot of things that probably wouldn't have mattered the first time I read these issues as a child. But again, Marvel was a scrappy upstart company. They were trying to compete with DC and Archie Comics at the time, which were pretty much the two big dogs in the fight. And with limited resources, an abundance of talent, and a little bit of money, they were able to put together some of the most exciting and creative books in the early and mid 60s. And there were obviously not a lot of people. I'd noticed a couple of typos in some of these stories, if you will. Peter Parker was referred to as Peter Palmer in one of the early issues. I think it was Spider-Man 2 or 3. And I think it's great that they left that mistake in the book. It adds a little bit of character to it. The other thing that's really changed over time is the spider sense. So I had forgotten that in these early issues, people actually understood that Spider-Man had some of the abilities of a spider, and they used radio waves and different types of technology to tap into what they believed to be Spider-Man's spider sense. And in one of the panels here, you can see Spider-Man, the chameleon, had figured this out and put up these antennas all over the city and was sending out messages to trap Spider-Man. So he was telling Spider-Man he wanted to meet him, and while Spider-Man was studying at the museum, he hears the message in his head, almost like he had an implant, or kind of the precursor to cell phones. The other thing that was interesting was Spider-Man was able to use his spider sense as almost a radar, if you will. And especially in the Vulture issues, Spider-Man would crisscross and swing over the city using his spider sense and directing it to try to pick up the trail of the Vulture. And they've used that mechanism in more recent issues, but not as much as they did in these early issues, as a specific way of, or ability that Spider-Man had, another tool in his box to help fight crime. Also, the early Spider-Man issues, while people talk about Steve Ditko drew him weak and skinny and blah, 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 his particular powers were way off the chart. So, again, one of the panels you see here, Spider-Man actually climbs out of a jet while it's flying and catches a space capsule that is out of control in order to save one of the astronauts, who happens to be J. Jonah Jameson's son. So these are abilities that I haven't really seen, although I will say, I want to say, was it 5 years ago maybe? There was a ridiculous issue of Spider-Man where he actually jumped from one of a satellite or a space station and free fell. He had a suit on, and once that suit burned off, then he, I guess, used the webbing and so forth. And he actually jumped from space back to planet Earth. I thought that was absolutely ridiculous, but going back and reading some of these issues, Spider-Man's been doing ridiculous things since the early days. The other interesting things to pick up in these old Spider-Man issues was the amount of story that got packed into each issue. The early issues had 2 full-length stories, and I think of the issue where Spider-Man meets the Fantastic Four that was done, I think, in 12 or 13 pages. And a story like that would be a 6 or 12 issue miniseries today. And going back and reading complete beginning, middle, and Spider-Man adventure stories that also included the building out of the supporting cast, also showing us what was happening in Peter's private life. They packed a lot of stuff into these old comics. In those early issues of Spider-Man, the other thing that came across was Peter Parker cried a lot, and Peter Parker was not always necessarily the mild-mannered, meek wimp of a character that he's often the kind of distilled version of Spider-Man Peter Parker that we get in broader pop culture. He was actually a very angry and somewhat deceitful kind of person in those early issues. So there's a couple of scenes here where I'm showing he had caught the Sandman and had him already trapped, but he hadn't set up his camera to take pictures. So he actually staged a fake fight scene with the Sandman, and as he's doing that, you can actually see in the word balloons here, he is going through the process of justifying doing something. He even says, oh, this can't be unethical because it actually happened, just not in the way I'm showing it here. The other thing that came across as interesting is all the way back, even in issue 1 of Spider-Man, he was already giving it back to Flash Thompson and the other people that gave him a hard time at school. And here you can see, and again, one of the panels I did a little screenshot here, is Peter Parker actually getting back, right up to Flash and telling him, hey, one day it's going to be different. And yes, sir, it's going to be a real pleasure to show you something, basically. There'll be a day where Peter Parker's not going to take it from you, and that day you're going to be very, very sorry. That is not the with great power comes great responsibility kind of motif that we've come to associate or keep with Spider-Man. And the other thing is that when Spider-Man loses, he immediately caves in and becomes feeling very sorry for himself. So, he's very, I'm not going to take this from you, Flash, but when he has his costume on, it's almost like he's a little bit weaker as the costume hero than he is as himself, as Peter Parker out in the real world. And again, oh my God, so much action. I mean, look at this. I mean, he's already fighting aliens. I mean, we are not even in issue 4 or 5, and Spider-Man is, built out. He's had battles with the Chameleon, the Tinkerer. As we get on here, we'll also talk about how eventually he does get into this fight with Flash Thompson. And in these split scenes here, Steve Ditko, you can really almost see the meanness. So there was one particular panel here where This was before Peter Parker breaks onto a military base, assaults a guard, hijacks a jet, and with a pilot to go capture and rescue the astronaut. But he's trying to decide if he actually wants to rescue the astronaut, because the astronaut is the son of J. Jonah Jameson. And, you know, he ponders whether he needs to rescue him. And in these panels here, he's even pondering whether he needs to go rescue Flash Thompson. Flash Thompson was getting ready to pull a prank on Spider-Man, dressed as or to play a prank on Peter Parker, and Flash had dressed up as Spider-Man and inadvertently was captured by Dr. Doom, who thought him to be the real Spider-Man. And then he issued a statement out challenging the Fantastic Four, because that's who he really wanted to fight, to come rescue Spider-Man, who he was holding as a hostage. And here Spider-Man's like, hey, this will take care of all my problems. If I just don't do anything, Dr. Doom will kill Flash Thompson, and then things will finally be going my way. I don't know about you, but that's super dark. And while he eventually talks himself out of it, for those couple of seconds there, Spider-Man, Peter Parker really gets those wheels turning. So there was a real darkness to these early Steve Ditko issues. And it must have been hard for Stan Lee, because they would talk about the story ideas, but for the most part, Steve Ditko would go and draw the entire issue from beginning to end, not from an outline, but from these story ideas. So even though a scene may have been talked about, how it would actually flow or be laid out on the panels, Stan Lee didn't know until the artwork arrived at the office. And then Stan Lee had to figure out a way to get the words to follow along with the story. So I think visually these split screens showed that the inner challenges that Peter Parker was having with being Spider-Man. And Steve Ditko showed us that he was more human, and these are the types of things that you might think about if you were instantly granted or had all of these powers available to you. Now, of course, over time, Peter Parker softened up and really leaned into with great responsibility, or with great power comes great responsibility. But again, it's funny because these early issues here, you can see he when he finally does get into the fight with Flash Thompson, he knocks him clean through the ring, by accident, of course, and then with a flick of the wrist actually knocks him unconscious. So not exactly the mild-mannered Peter Parker that we've come to know. Some of the other interesting observations from these early issues of Spider-Man. Lots of radiation happening. So the spider that bit Peter Parker was radiated in the lab. Sandman's origin story, you could put it almost panel for panel, minus the crime spree, up against the Incredible Hulk. So inadvertently stumbled into a testing area. And again, this is super interesting because the Marvel Universe was supposed to rotate around the Metro New York area. So again, in these early issues of Spider-Man, we're doing space launches, we're doing nuclear tests. We have all kinds of things going on in and around New York City. But when the Lizard shows up, Spider-Man has to craft a lie in order to trick J. Jonah Jameson into paying for a trip to Florida so that Spider-Man can take up the challenge of capturing and fighting the Lizard. So, again, why would Spider-Man accept a challenge? In these early issues, J. Jonah Jameson was at the height of his power as a publisher and was writing and publishing stories about how bad Spider-Man was, about how he was a vigilante, why would he hide his face, and he must be up to no good. There were the early criminals. The Chameleon used a Spider-Man costume to set Spider-Man up to be the fall guy for the crimes the Chameleon was doing. And even the Vulture performed some of his crimes in such a way to make it look like Spider-Man might be involved. And J. Jonah Jameson even went to the point to say that I believe that Spider-Man and Electro are actually the same person. So it was kind of funny to read all of this stuff now, because even back in the 60s, fake news, the power of the press, and its ability to influence the public and drive public opinion was one of the major story points and character points. I mean, that was the whole reason for the J. Jonah Jameson character. So very often J. Jonah Jameson would use a lot of the logic we see today, so, such as, well, until someone can prove to me that it's not true, then the possibility exists, and if the possibility exists, then there is truth in that. And that is how J. Jonah Jameson basically kept up his campaign against Spider-Man. But the flip side of that is, again, in light of recent events, this is the comic book world, so I get it. But at the time, people weren't comfortable with all of these superheroes or people that had power or access to weapons or technology taking it upon themselves to decide what's right and wrong, and exacting what they believe to be justice in a way that they felt was appropriate. So, again, a topic that's in the news today. These early issues of Spider-Man, he fought a supercomputer that had AI. So again, this is a reality, but back then, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko were thinking ahead. Well, if the computers of our time can do this, then moving forward, let's see what that evolution might look like. Will we be able to get these machines to the place where they can think and do some problem solving? It was super interesting that the inputs for the supercomputer had to be done in programming, and Peter Parker, even as a high school student, was able to quickly get up to speed. And in these issues, what they said was that in order to program the supercomputer, the information that they were putting in had to be converted into a mathematic equation. And again, if you think about what basic computer programming is, zeros and ones, for the most part, it is taking the data that you want to have as part of to be considered as part of the data sets to be used in the calculations. They have to be converted into a format in which the computer can understand it. So on the one hand, the comics still read very fresh because these are things that exist or could happen in the world today. But at the same time, they were also somewhat dated, because instead of the internet and television, the newspapers were how people were getting their news, and they had newsstands. And it was a whole point of, if you wanted to get updated, you had to either take a look at the TV. And again, for the 60s, a lot of on-the-spot reporting as crimes were happening. So super interesting that Spider-Man could turn on the TV to see live footage of the Sandman robbing banks, and then be able to suit up and go out and try to apprehend the criminals. So super fascinating that that Spider-Man even had to take advantage of the low-tech, high-tech they had at the times to up his game, including police scanners, the television, and the newspapers, to get ideas of how to get after the criminals. So there you go, issues 1 through 6, a little kind of revisit of the Spider-Man. A lot of reading here, actually. So the last thing I'll end on was reading a current comic book. The art is beautiful, the paper's beautiful, the texture of the comics is wonderful and slick, and it takes me maybe 15 minutes to read a current comic book. These older issues of Spider-Man, I actually, we're talking a good 40 minutes to get through a complete issue. So they were actually very satisfying, and it's also easy to understand how the Spider-Man or even the early Marvel Universe canon got built up, because they actually took the time to develop the characters, to provide every single issue enough of the adventure and the human interest to move these stories forward, and the entire universe forward. I feel like that a lot of the comics I read today are either 6 or 12 issue self-contained stories that either, an artist or an artist writer want, this is a particular one story that they want to tell, and not so much about like moving the entire universe and the entire supporting cast forward. So I would recommend, these are awesome. These issues still hold up. I'm having a great time, and I'm looking forward to continuing to plow through these this week and next week as we head into the fall. So another activity we've been using to try to spend some time as a family together is we've gone back to the drive. And it's still, a lot of things are locked down here in Northern California. And the idea of going out to a place where there's going to be a lot of other people, we're still not very comfortable with. So for us, one of the things we've kind of leaned back into is taking a drive. And one of the things that's a joy now is we're not in a rush to get anywhere. I'm not in a rush to get to the airport, get home, get to work. So traffic is no longer an issue. If we're in the car, we're usually talking or listening to music. And Parker's old enough to join in the conversations and introduce some of her own humor. We were talking about the move, when we might be able to move and how that might look. And she was joking around because she had heard me talk to some folks about my experiences every time I try to cross the Canadian border. I've been around the world, but for some reason, every time I try to go to Canada, it's a thing. It's a thing. And Parker was saying, well, if you guys ever upset me and I need to run away, at least I know where to go to. I can go to Canada because everybody's nice there and you can't get to me. And I thought that was super funny because as an 11-year-old, I thought it was interesting that she took some snippets of conversations over the past few years and little pieces of information she had put together, and then applied that information in a very creative and humorous way to a different topic that we were talking about. So just to be clear, Parker's not upset. She's not looking to run away. It's more it's more just her way of being a little bit sarcastic, she's got a little Wheatley in her. So that was, cracked us up in the car when she threw that out. We were actually last week driving to Sonic, and even that's funny because now our drives typically involve ending up at some sort of food or drink, and the places Parker likes to go to, are, for the most part, it seems like they're East Coast kind of places. So she loves going to Sonic. We don't have a lot of Sonics out here, but we do have one that's maybe 40 minutes away. So maybe every other week, as a treat, we'll make the ride over to Sonic. Also over 30 to 40 minutes away is Dunkin'. And Parker, from the time she spent on the East Coast staying with me when I was working at Chobani and Regeneron, that she loves Dunkin' Donuts. She loves Dunkin' Donuts iced coffee and, of course, the donuts. So anytime there's an opportunity for us to go to Dunkin' Donuts, she's ready for that. So it seems like at least once a week, we drive up to Petaluma, which is about 10, 11 miles north from here, to go visit the Dunkin' up there. It's one of the ways we make sure that we still connect. I do cook, so we do the dinners. For those of you that look on Facebook, you see I post the things from HelloFresh when we make the meals. But now we've gotten so accustomed to, Parker has her friends and does her things online, and I have my office, Evil Lair, in here where I can work on things. And my wife, now that she's working, when she comes home, she has her bubble that she goes into. So these drives are a way, at least for an hour and a half, where we're not on our phones, where we are talking to each other, where we as a family are picking out which music to listen to. More often than not, Parker's doing the picks, and we listen to cuts from Hamilton or the new Taylor Swift album or some other things that typically I wouldn't listen to, but I appreciate the fact that she's starting to develop her own taste, and I really want to support anything with the arts with her. So, speaking of the arts, as Parker's developing her own tastes and kind of building her own story and her own pop culture heroes, we have an interesting kind of setup here. So here's a shot of her dresser, and as you can see, yep, very girly. So we got the Mickey Mouse and the Disney stuff and Lilo and Stitch. And then out of nowhere, a can of Flex Seal and a Phil Swift poster. She is just so enamored with Phil Swift and the posters and the humor behind it. I think she views her affection with Flex Seal is very hipster. It's almost an ironic kind of fandom, if you will, versus her wanting to know more about Walt Disney. And what you see here are a couple of items I picked up on eBay for her, some vintage Disney books. And both of these books were put together through his daughter, Diane Disney Miller. The first one, the little paperback book, actually came out in the 50s. And the one we have there, the Dell version, was the first printing of the paperback edition. It came out in hardcover first. Those are ridiculously expensive to buy from the... now, they've reprinted that, the story of Walt Disney up until, or all the way through the early 2000s, and you can buy inexpensive versions, but they don't have this cover, and I was able to get that on eBay at a fairly reasonable price, as well as the Walt Disney His Life in Pictures. Now that book is from the 90s, so you know it's still got some 25 plus year stank on it, but definitely a newer edition, and I was able to get that. I think that was like $5 or $6, plus a couple dollars to have it shipped here. And Parker treasures these things so much. I had asked her. I said, "So is like Walt Disney kind of your Stan Lee, if you will, because of her affection for a lot of the Disney characters, especially Lilo and Stitch. Those seem to be the characters in the stories that she gravitates to the most." But again, I want to support her in finding her own art, her own passion, the things that she likes to talk about. And we have a care package coming from the Flex Seal people. So very soon, Parker and I are going to be doing some do-it-yourself or do-it-at-home videos, our versions of the Phil Swift Flex Seal commercials, if you will, her take. And then we'll be posting, and I'll share those here, maybe one or two over the next couple of weeks as we start to finish those out. All right, so that's what I got for us this week. The updates on the payphones, a little sharing my Kirby collector box, as well as running down some of those early issues of Spider-Man and how they held up today, and then bringing us home with an update on our Flex Seal adventures and some of the tchotchkes and eBay stuff we've been finding as Parker learns more about the life and times of Walt Disney. So I'm going to say thank you for... we'll be back next Sunday on our regular schedule, and I really want to thank I think it's like 2 people that maybe listen to me right now, but this is one of my outlets, and I appreciate anybody taking time to listen to any bit of this. Please feel free to provide any type of feedback. Again, I'm not looking for likes or subscriptions unless you're compelled to do such a thing. We're not looking for sponsors or to monetize anything. This is just me sharing with the internet from the left coast. So until next Sunday, I'll thank you one last time and ask you to check in at leftcoastlove2020.com. And Jackson says goodbye. We'll catch you next week. Bye.